Okay, so welcome to the LAC with me, Nina Power, Helen Rollins and Benjamin Studebaker. This week it is me and Helen on our own again, as occasionally happens, and we, take it in turns to be a 3 or a 2. And this week we are in the A side talking about regime aesthetics with reference to what we might call, I suppose, Instagram poetry, and also I suppose politically acceptable poetry, or poetry that's designed to add a kind of ideological, emotional, literary supplement to the regime. And then I think in the B side we will be talking about therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And the state of therapeutic practice in relation to political questions, amongst other things.
Sounds interesting.
It does.
I'm excited.
Fascinating. Who are these people and what do they want? And why am I listening to them? Okay, so Helen, if you would like to begin.
Right. Okay. Well, I haven't got an essay this week because the last time we just did a more informal chat, which kind of worked. But we were deciding what to do this week, and we decided we didn't want to do a film. We wanted to do something that was sort of like biteable. Like bite-sized. Yes. That's the word, bite-sized. And what is more bite-sized than the Instagram poetry that we see these days? Obviously there's one particularly well-known exponent of said type of poetry, but this isn't really just about that. I think this is about all kinds of I don't know, I mean, you're more the poetess, so you would have more maybe knowledge about like what defines poetry. But I have seen in 2021 and in the past number of years, I think it started for me, the annoyance or the annoyment I get from slam poetry. When you see all these, there are these ads that started about 10 years ago, and they have this sort of like, either this like national pride type bad poetry voiceover, or this is one where it's like different categories of person poetry voiceover. So it's like, for the snacker, the packer, the I don't know, something that rhymes with that. They do these different things for the like hippie tree hugger and the rough mudder runner, that kind of thing. I don't know if you notice this, and it would happen all the time. Ads are quite funny because you get these aesthetic trends in ads. Yeah. And we've talked a little bit about in the past episodes, I think, about what is art and what are sort of aesthetic trends. And I think in ads, from the filmmaking point of view, you get these very, very nice to look at aesthetic trends. And this is an auditory aesthetic trend, potentially, these poems, and they're so repeated to the extent we were like, how can you not see the similarity? They sort of like, is it plagiarism when everyone does it? I don't know, but there's something about poetry, this kind of poetry, where like an authority is lent to it because it has a poetry aesthetic. So obviously we have a lot of terms that are being developed in terms of kind of quote unquote theory. And, if it's always like, if it rhymes or if it has a sort of like inner alliteration or some kind of an onomatopoeia, it's like, oh, it's an actual like scientific term. I'm trying to think of an example, but these sort of made up terms that as if they are some sort of encyclopedic definition, but they're someone's invention, and they have this sort of like rhythm or a sort of aesthetic to them, a poeticism to them that like points to officialdom. And I think there's something about poetry or the aesthetic of poetry that it points to a kind of quote unquote transcendent truth because it has a vibe. but really, when you read or listen to these, not only is the aesthetic very grating because this sort of trick, the visual or the phonic trick is revealed really quickly, but also what is being written is generally highly ideological. I do think a tell I always say with ideology is heartwarming. Heartwarming, I think it tends to be very ideological versus like actually emotional, sensitive, thought-provoking, moving. It's a heartwarmingness. But these are just sort of like cliched truths, quote unquote, that are sort of given this veneer of heft with this weird poeticism. And I don't know that much about slam poetry other than several years ago I was at this event with some friends, and it was this sort of a philosophy event, and people were giving different types of interventions with like different, you know, artists and musicians and talks and stuff. And someone stood up and gave a slam poem. And I was sitting next to a good friend of mine, and we, you know, the first rendition, we were like, oh, that's good. That's very impressive. You know, it really punches you in the gut. It's sort of clever little tricks that you think like, gosh, that's very clever. And then it's repeated, and it's very, sorry, 1 second. Hang on. Oh my gosh, we're gonna have to pause for a second because my
Sure.
recording just stopped. I'm just gonna see when that stopped. That's crazy. Yeah, okay, so if we just do, we might have to re-clap because it's clever using that like, right, it's because
I mean, you have the Zoom recording, obviously.
yeah, we have the Zoom recording here, just have to piece it together, but my mic, right, my mic has, oh fuck, I was using another computer and then I was like, I'll use this one because it's new, but now the mic is fucking up. What I'm gonna have to do is use the computer microphone.
Sure.
Yes, your microphone, right. What I'll do is I'll use MacBook Air microphone and I'll record again, see if it's working. Yes, it's working. It's not going to be great, but that's the way it is. Right. Should we clap again?
Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. So, as I was saying, this poetry really punches you in the gut, and it has this sort of panache, you know. But the second time it's repeated, you start, the repetition makes you see the tricks that are much less clever than they seemed in the first place, which I think is kind of a bit dangerous for sort of this kind of ideological art, because it's very obviously a trick, a little, you know, what do you call it? The patter of the, you know, the magician that is ideology, you know, tricking you into sort of thinking and seeing things in a certain way. And the patter is this sort of slam poetry, let's say. And you hear the sort of emphasis, the end of the line, the fast and the slow, the loud and the quiet, the internal rhyme. And really, it's just a chimera. And obviously there's a very famous example last year during the inauguration. And the response to it, I have to say, I think pointed to what we've been talking about a lot, the ideological racism of liberalism, which is somebody who we consider this Orientalist view of an individual who personifies a proximity to essence, an undivided nature, and a wisdom, the wisdom of little children. So the youth, the appearance, the smallest in stature, the speech impediment is all very important to this, because this is the ideology of the age. You know, when people point out racism everywhere, I hate to do it as well, but there is a racism somewhere, and it is Orientalism. And this kind of, I would call it weak art, easy, I don't know, easy art, is that what it is? Non-art appearance of art is something, I think, where you find a lot of this Orientalism in terms of a truth being pointed out. So an elevation of a truth that is really cliched and actually ideological, to the status of something ethereal, transcendent, and important. And I think all of these things, the youth of the performer, obviously we see slam poetry, I think it's like a young person's game generally. I think all of this contributes to sort of the what we see as the ideological pattern for this kind of thing.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I wonder if poetry that we have in mind. I'm going to experimentally attempt to read some of Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem. What do you think? Just
okay, but what we should maybe say is this isn't about Amanda Gorman per se. This is the kind of art, and I'm sure
exactly. But I think there's something also, you know, like precisely you were saying about isolating and identifying, let's say, the gimmicks or you know, the tricks in the text. So yeah, so this is obviously not you know, I don't know anything about this person other than that she was 22. She read this this poem at Joe Biden's swearing in. You know, that's it. I mean, there was some controversy over the translators, and that this also feeds into what you were saying about the Orientalism, the racism of contemporary liberalism, in the sense that the idea, you know, even though we share an alphabet and a language, you know, whether we're talking about translating within the same alphabet, the idea that the way some people put the alphabet together has a different essence than other people, such that even if someone is a highly trained linguist and translator, that they somehow won't be able to translate the work of somebody else because of their identity. I mean, this is insane, right? You know, I mean, this is a level of, you know, ontological racism that is so profound that it actually detracts from the character of all of us as speaking beings, you know, and basically suggests that we cannot understand one another in any case, you know, that there is simply you know, an impossibility of communication, even with between the most highly trained translators and so on. And I think there's this kind of increasing confusion, not only between, let's say, the artist and their work, such that we have this new puritanical moralism, such that, you know, if anyone has ever done anything bad or said anything wrong, then their entire course is then, you know, supposed to be consigned to the flames, in some cases literally, people calling for book burning, you know. And on the other side, so the kind of inherent goodness of the artist must be preserved, and the link between the artist and the work must be completely fused, which then gets confused with the idea of a kind of attempt to make reparations or restoration for historical asymmetries. So the idea that a Black poet must only be translated by a Black poet in another country, or by a Black translator in another country, as a way of somehow making good on historical in the present, right, at this kind of very micro level. And this, of course, is not the same as saying, you know, that there's a collective question of who gets to do what work, when and how they get paid, and what the working conditions are, and, you know, who has access to forms of training such as translation skills and all of that kind of thing. You know, it's a micro vengeance, we could say. You know, and I think worlds like the poetry world or the art world, you know, are incredibly prone to these kinds of gestures, you know, because in a way they're so flimsy, they're so insecure as worlds, and that, you know, they're so tied up with very ancient feelings of envy and, you know, the desire to be successful and rivalry, that any kind of little thing can be used to, you know, try to, I don't know, get ahead or destroy your enemy or whatever. And, you know, this gets played out over and over and over again. And so I think there is something to be said by looking at, you know, the text though itself, because after all, there are still words, right? There's still these texts, and they do tell us something, perhaps. You know, and of course you could say, I mean, no doubt there are people who would say, you know, a white person can't or shouldn't read work written by a Black person or something like this. You know, that there would be an argument to be made for a kind of you know, a segregated politics of purity, if you like, such that, you know, all forms of exchange are potentially forms of contamination or theft, if you see what I mean, you know. But this can't possibly, I mean, even from the standpoint of selling lots of copies of something, right, from a purely commercial standpoint, it doesn't make sense to segregate literature in this way. I mean, that, you know, we have to say that there is a universalizing impulse in language. You know, if we are trained to speak English, you know, and someone else speaks English, it's the same language. You know, calling something poetry doesn't dignify it, and it doesn't essentialize it in some radical way. You know, it's if someone can understand you, then they can understand you. You know, and I think these kind of pretend forms of roadblocks, the idea that we simply can't understand someone else's experience, even though they're describing it to you, or even worse, that we can't criticize something that someone's written because they are part of like a non-criticizable class, you know, I mean, is from any standpoint, you know, absolutely horrific. I mean, it is assigning the capacity to somebody of that, like that of a child, you know, or an animal.
The worst. I think it's profoundly racist.
Yeah, I mean, of course it is, you know, and like we can talk about the tyranny of low expectations, and, you know, how even this kind of I don't know, mild liberal you know, position of literary criticism that I'm sort of outlining, you know, basically makes you a Nazi these days. I mean, you know, like if you say, like, if people put work out into the world, then it can be read, it should be read, and it can be criticized. You know, I mean, this is the public sphere, if you like. So in any case, I'm going to read I suppose the final paragraph of this poem, and I'm not going to read it necessarily in a sarcastic way or anything like that. I'm going to just try and read it as it's written.
In a neutral, up on my phone as well.
Yeah, in a neutral as possible way, I suppose. And I haven't practiced reading this at all, so I'm simply going to read it as it is. So, you know, and this is from January last year. Yeah. No, sorry, not this year. This year, January this year. Yeah. My God, sorry, I'm getting the plot time wise. I was trying to remember what year it was yesterday.
No, I cannot believe it's absolutely.
No, I mean, this is part of the regime. It's trying to disorientate,
yeah,
your relation to time.
Sorry, we can talk about that later, because I think that's
no, but this is mental. Okay, so like we're now in August, okay, and we're talking about a poem that was, you know, given at the inauguration in January. So we're already full into COVID regime era here. Okay, so sorry, the poem is by Amanda Gorman, and it's called The Hill We Climb. And the final paragraph, stanza, sorry, I should say. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the golden hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. In every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So reading this as just, you know, as it's up on my laptop screen, the word that stands out for me the most is rebuild. You know, that this is written, a poem presented in the context of, you know, post-Trump, post-Trump, but also in relation to the Great Reset. And, you know, we're talking about a period in which we saw the BLM protests last summer, and obviously Biden's, you know, ideological presentation and sheen is deeply tied up with not only being anti-Trump, but also pro-BLM, pro all of the, you know, excesses of identity politics. You know, even though, well, I mean, Biden doesn't exist. I mean, Biden is nothing. He's a snowman. I want to say, a telegram. No, I don't mean a telegram. He's a hologram.
Hologram.
He's a hologram. Biden is a hologram. I mean, you know, he is, you know, he's clearly, you know, suffering from some form of
Old age.
age-related mental lack of acuity. So in a sense, it's nothing even to do with Biden. It's we're talking about the regime. We're talking about what the, you know, and the ideological supplement. So this is an acceptable, clearly highly acceptable form of ideological supplement. It's not as badly written as some of the Instagram poetry we might refer to. You know, it's not
actually reading it. I was sort of like, that is actually not bad.
Yeah,
it's not bad. It's, you know, this isn't like a great, you know, piece of work that will join the canon, but it's not terrible. And you know, and actually there's some it has really nice imagery, and it is very it is well written.
It's like a defanged Maya Angelou. It's a bit like And I Rise.
Yeah.
Still I Rise, sorry.
Still I Rise, yeah.
Still I Rise. It's a bit like that. But it's sort of toned down, you know. I mean, even though it's talking about revolution and, you know, I mean, it does have this rebuild, reconcile and recover. You know, there is something kind of conciliatory about it as well. And it's not very specific, we have to say.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't point to specific harms, or, you know, it's an attempt to say there is hope in this fusion of the recognition of, you know, bad things and this new regime represented by the hologram Biden.
Yeah, I mean the line in it.
Well,
sorry, yeah.
Go on.
I was going to say that the line in it about you know, the where our forefathers first realized revolution. You know, this isn't throwing out quote unquote old white men. You know, there is, you know, there it is pointing to something beyond pure identity politics.
Yes, exactly. But the thing I wanted to say about discussion earlier about, you know, this idea of the bite size, that it really strikes me, and I agree, and I think, you know, that kind of you know, Instagram poetry is kind of like the sort of script you might get on a cushion, you know, that's been sewn by a machine, except maybe the machine has died of sadness because it's had to write this unbearably awful poem on a bit of soft furnishing. You know, and I think, you know, if we read some of the Rupi Kaur stuff, I don't know how you pronounce her surname, which obviously makes me a terrible person. Do you know how to pronounce her surname properly?
Yeah, it would be Rupi Kaur, right? I mean, I have a friend
Kaur,
who has the same surname, so.
Right, okay, great. So Rupi Kaur, right? So if you read some of her poems, they're a bit like this one, you know. So they're all written in lowercase, you know, like a text message. The line breaks don't necessarily they don't make any you know, you could send them in a little text message and they've got little pictures on them. So this one, I don't know what it's called. It just says, I do not need the kind of love that is draining. I want someone who energizes me. I mean, that's I mean, yeah, I mean, it serves, it's got like a negative Zen koan effect, like, you know, when you read those Zen koan things and you're put into a state of like twing, you know, like the sound of one hand clapping, or you're supposed to visualize or conceptualize things that, you know, are sort of create this like they're like that, but really it's kind of like the anti-thought that makes it possible to live in a regime. You know, it's like that. It's not even cognitive dissonance, it's like cognitive emptiness, you know. And I think this kind of, the point about bite-sized things, you know, if you buy a packet of bite-sized, I don't know, crunchy bits or something, the thing is you always end up eating more than you would have done had you eaten the original crunchy bar. So you feel sick, you know. So the consumption of bite-sized things is designed to make you eat more of the thing in small amounts, but ultimately in large amounts, that then makes you feel incredibly ill. And
the dialectic of the fun size.
Exactly. exactly. So, you know, and everybody knows this, right? It's like one of those no things, you know, do you know it? And you know it. And,
Yeah.
you know, so the bite-sized poem like this, you know, in a way, you know, and it's a kind of combination of like the haiku, the text message, you know, with the little pictures that are like, I don't know, illustrations from children's books, or, you know, it's like this fusion of different forms in this attempt to kind of create this, you know, new genre, as it were, although that's sort of maybe dignifying it a little bit. And, you know, and also the self-help, we have to say. So like soft furnishing self-help, you know, like this one, you know, you have so much, but are always hungry for more. Stop looking up at everything you don't have and look around at everything you do. I mean, you know, it could be written by a machine, a very unhappy machine, you know, and I mean,
yeah.
I mean, it's the kind of thing that makes you feel like you're Theodore Adorno, like eating a lemon, this stuff, you know, because it's so excruciatingly like, and you're like this bitter motherfucker who's like, you know, when someone says, oh, come and see some slam poetry or some experimental theatre, and you're like waiting for it to begin, and you're like, yeah, you know, and then you just feel like this sort of horrible inversion of criticism that's going on in your body. And, you know, to be fair to slam poetry, at the very least, say the worst slam poetry has a form of passion behind it,
Yeah.
even if it's horrible, you know, even if it's like grotesque rhyming, you know, like a sort of 15-year-old stoner might come up with when they're like, you know, feeling a bit angry at the world, and they're like, you know, you don't know how bad things are out there in the world, you know, whatever. I mean, just at least it's an attempt to sort of try and encapsulate a feeling of injustice or opposition or something like this. I mean, this clearly, you know, has none of that. You know, there is no emotion, there's no humanness in these somehow. You know, they are literally, you know, an AI making soft furnishings, you know, writing this script. And, you know, I suppose one of the interesting questions, if we're talking about regime aesthetics, just to finish on this point in the first bit, you know, what is permissible to say, you know, and like we know obviously that there are many things that people now unconsciously or consciously know they cannot talk about and should not say, right? So we've already entered into very obviously regimes of self-censorship, you know, the expansion of hate speech legislation, you know, punish anybody steps out of line in terms of particular regime statements or particular permitted thoughts. So we're already past that point. But then if the aesthetic supplement, which it does in some way, not only to sell things, but also to, in a way, give itself a veneer of cover story, right? Because a civilization that completely dispenses with the poetic is a machine. You know, it's not a civilization as we would understand it. You know, every civilization has to try and tell stories about itself, right? So what story is the regime saying about itself? But in these poems, it's saying absolutely nothing. It's saying the most minimal things you can possibly imagine. It's not talking about anything specific. It's vaguely alluding to emotion in a certain way, but in this kind of gestural self-help sort of way, you know, that in a way that feeds very much into a kind of therapeutic culture that we're going to talk about, I think, in the B side. You know, political, really, although in a sense it's kind of almost the most political, precisely because it's completely deprived of any political sentiment, you know, and I'm not by any means saying that all poetry has to be political. In fact, a lot of political poetry is terrible. I mean, of course it is. But yeah, it's so, I don't know, what are we to make of this?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and for the effects that it has, I suppose, on thought, you know, and I think this idea, the negative Zen koan, the one that doesn't lead to enlightenment but leads to dystopia, further dystopia, is maybe something here.
Yes, I got out my notebook and started making notes because there's so much that you said that I want to sort of like circle back on. But the thing is, this question of what is political, I actually do think, just my opinion, it could be wrong, that when we experience something that's aggravatingly political, it isn't political, and that's why it's aggravating. It remains in the aesthetic, and it doesn't do the full dialectic of going back to the universal. So it is precisely apolitical. When it locks down the universal contradiction into some opponent making, that's not political, that is preventing the political from happening. But yeah, it is interesting as well, the fact that you say this bite-size thing, and you call it écœurant in French, like it's disheartening. When you feel sick, it's like, disheartening in a way. But you get this multiplication. I mean, these are posted like daily. And as I say, with this multiplication of the slam poetry tricks, you see the tricks so fast, and it's sort of, it like washes it all away, but it's still there. It's very strange. But also as well, I think that point is really interesting about this sort of like negative Zen. And this is all, we've talked about this a lot in terms of like discourse and dialogue, that you require another always. And we live in a society, and we'll talk about this a lot on the B side, I think, where therapy has stepped in. I think therapy, obviously we have different types of therapy, some good, some bad. And I think the criticism of therapy is misplaced, because I think it's more a symptom than a cause, or at least two things can be true at the same time. I think it is a symptom as well as an ideological cause. But I think we are in a world where, as Benjamin talks about, our roles have been so eroded, our family structures are so eroded, our civil society is so eroded, governments are underfunded because they tie themselves to capital. Now capital rules government, and nobody can tax the corporations and wealthy individuals. Capital mobility. We have eroded everything that gives our life meaning in terms of connection with other people. And this is what's left. It's this self-pontificating, righteous demand that is always negative and always depressing. Like, I want to have a relationship where I'm treated well. It's like, well, a relationship, obviously there are many forms of toxic relationship. And of course, in a world where material relations rule supreme, as Mark said, I texted this to somebody the other day, and I'm going to get it up on my phone now, a little bite-size statement. Where is it? Got it the other day. Real time, hashtag real time. Okay, maybe it's too far back. Maybe I sent it weeks ago. Oh, here we go. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Okay, so a lot of the problems that we have in terms of relationships today are to do with the fact that it has become so transactional, and the transaction makes it anxiety producing and traditional. Again, talking about therapy as a symptom as well as a cause. There's a lot of quote unquote leftist movements today that destroy the things that are a symptom rather than a cause. So family as a symptom, as a reaction mechanism to protect against the ravages of the market. And if we get rid of the family, but we don't get rid of the market, well, we're just opening ourselves up to the absolute precarity and anxiety and horror of a purely transactional world. So This is very one-sided. And I find it interesting that when we talk about leftism, often this is something that has not a vision of the market system or an understanding of it at all, which is very strange. But yes, this sort of personal outrage issue, I can understand why people do feel personally outraged now, because we're also personally affected by this move. But what we really need is connection with other people. And this comes from a political change whereby we find a way to tax correctly, we find a way to deal with capital mobility, and we really work on a society of people, But the last thing I wanted to say, just in relation to what you were saying, is so obviously Barthes, the death of the author. And this is, a major movement in literary criticism, and a really, really brilliant notion. Obviously, at the same time, it is works are written or created by a person. So, we cannot but think of them when we read a piece of work. But, two things can be true at the same time. A text as a text can be read through a death of the author lens. And then, we can also have some maybe personal biographical interest in the individual, and what about their conditions allow them to write it, and their personality and all this kind of stuff. But what has really happened now, and I think I talked about this at the beginning a little bit, and again, when you said let's read the Amanda Gorman thing, and I'm like, oh, this is the poem, this isn't about her. The trouble is, it makes it so difficult to talk about it without being accused of being personal towards a person, and they're all of the intersections of their life, because this regime demands that the individual be tied to the product, because it is a market, because you cannot sell a piece of universal work that enters into the world that isn't tied to the story of an individual that has a set of genius criteria that we can, that they have some whole, so it's either a genius of the individual rather than, one of the reasons I really like Hegel is like, we are the workings out of, we are the personification of the contradiction of the universe. And our freedom is to choose to live into that working out. We are free to recognize ourselves as the working out of the universe. And that is completely contradictory to an individual who has either got a special set of traits that they can teach you a lesson, that they can offer you either as an expression of themselves, a certain wisdom that can close your gap of lack, or by using this sort of identity politics trick. So we have this universalist idea from Marx and others, and then this identity politics trick where they take the aesthetics of the universal, but actually lock it down into sort of a slightly broader oppositional particularity of identity politics. And it's like, this young person has this wisdom because they are undivided, like the genius. This person, so it's an essential genius. When we talk about essence, it always can be marketized. But there is no essence. That marketization is an illusion. It's real, but it's based on an illusion.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back to the Barthes idea of, the death of the author is the birth of the reader. But I think, there's a sense in which in the internet age that reading itself is over. There's scrolling without reading, maybe, or something like this. And, there's some very work on reading in this regard in the work of Angelicism 01. I'm going to use his pseudonym, but someone who's very, very interesting on this question of, if you like, how reading doesn't happen anymore. So in a way, you could say like the Rupi Kaur poems are liked in a certain sense. They're to be consumed but not read, perhaps. Because reading is something like, would involve interpretation, would involve, the idea of hermeneutics in a way comes from reading the Bible and sort of scriptural study, which would be to do with also thinking about kind of allegory and, moral implication and the situatedness of the reader. And obviously, we don't have to recapitulate the whole history of reading the Bible and all of those kinds of things. But, I've been looking at a lot of work on technology lately because I'm teaching Illich, and I've been reading like Jacques Ellul on the Technological Society and Lewis Mumford. And there's a great quote I came across from Jacques Ellul the other day, where he's writing this in 1954, and he's talking about the year 2000. So this is what he imagines the year 2000 will be like. He says, knowledge will be accumulated in electronic banks and transmitted directly to the human nervous system by means of coded electronic messages. There will no longer be any need of reading or learning mountains of useless information. Everything will be received and registered according to the needs of the moment. There will be no need of attention or effort. What is needed will pass directly from the machine to the brain without going through consciousness. And I posted this, someone suggested that this technology already exists. It's called television. But I wonder, and we have this fantasy also in the Matrix, the idea of just inserting a chip, like, that you're some kind of console or you're a machine and you can just insert something, so that the process of reading or studying or thinking, is in a way bypassed completely, right? And what you have then is the effect you know, that either you'll just simply know how to do something, or that you'll have a particular feeling or sensation, as if you're kind of like directly jacking into your CNS, and you know, and like that's what I think, you know, maybe we have to start thinking about these, you know, and it's obvious that everything we see and read and every image that we encounter has an effect on us, right? These are not neutral things. You know, even if you think, oh, I'm cynical, I'm, you know, I can take anything, you know, I can watch horror films and see disgusting things and I'm unaffected or whatever, you know, or that you become numb or desensitized. It, on some other level, that's simply not true. Like, everything you consume has an effect on you, whether it's food or images or, you know, pornography or Rupi Kaur poems or whatever. And so the question, I suppose, would be like, how do we, you know, by trying to pin down something of the affect or the effect, A or E, of these things, to isolate the kind of sentiment or feeling that, you know, if we say that these are regime aesthetics, or at least they're aesthetics that are rewarded by the regime and promoted by the regime, you know, what kind of creature is the regime trying to create?
Well, it's interesting when you say consume, the image that I really have is sucking on a teat, you know. And this is to not be human yet. This is to be the pre-verbal fetus born once into a world. You know, every substance is subject, everything is marked by contradiction. So you're still a contradictory being that, you know, working yourself out through evolution, but you do not enter into the human state of self-conscious division until you speak. And this sort of undividedness, it really, I mean, I say I drink a lot of milk, drinking a cup of milk here. Like, this is, it just, it really is like teat sucking. And the thing is, we are divided beings. And I think there's a huge antagonism that we feel between the teat sucking and the fact that we know that the world is more complicated, and we are more complicated than this. We are. And it is frustrating when that complication, that nuance, that reason that we all, as speaking subjects, all have, all of us, every single one.
Yeah. Like
every single speaking subject. I think this is a profound, it's aggravating, it's disorientating, it drives you mad. It drives you mad. And everyone you speak to, even people who, you know, we all are engaged in ideology in many ways. You know, we do have, this is somewhere that I disagree with. I remember, I think it was like a Michael Brooks talk. He was talking about, you know, everybody is within ideology. And it's like, we do have the capacity, I think, to get beyond ideology. We do. I disagree that we're always within ideology all the time. I think, you know, we are mired by ideology, but we can have moments where we can get a reprieve. I do believe that. But I think it's this alienation, and you know, we're treated like children who are no longer children. And what happens when you treat, you know, this, you know, that program like Super Nanny, where you get that like woman who's like the large neo Mary Poppins. And often if you watch that program, the reason why the children are getting sort of like really badly behaved is that they're being treated so childishly. You know, they're not. So I was watching one episode like 10 years ago, but a couple who very sadly really struggled to have children. They only managed to have one child very late, and they were protecting it as if it was this sort of crystal being. And it was like 2 or 3, and they would only put it in its playpen, and it would, the symptom of his rage was all to do with escaping. So they'd take him to a park and he'd like run away. And it was like, you know, it turned out that the nanny sat and observed, and she was like, you know, you're treating him like a child that's way younger than he is. And at some point, you know, he's trying to overcome the boundaries that is his natural process. And I think that, you know, people are very angry about this, very angry.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back to the milk question, because I think, you know, as someone who has never breastfed, I think, you know, probably it did have an effect on being very hyperlexic and insomniac very early on. Like I think you know, it probably probably made the entity that I was more aware of its separation.
Yeah.
You know, but earlier perhaps in some ways, you know, and I like, for better or worse, definitely worse for everyone, you know, then you have a subject that's almost too independent.
Yeah.
Actually, and too divided from others, because you know, you don't generate a bond, or you don't generate a kind of, you know, dependency in the same way. I mean, of course, you know, my father fed me with formula milk, right? It wasn't that I wasn't fed, obviously I'd be dead otherwise, right? But so there was a substitute, of course, you know, but it was not, you know, real milk.
This is the thing though, because what you know, and we often like want to replicate, you know, in relationships we replicate earlier stuff, but like there is a process, you know, and we are like qualitatively different at 0 to compared to 30, you know. And so this is, you know, I sometimes think like the recipe, and a friend of mine who's a psychoanalyst, and you know, always says about how when a child is too verbal too quickly, too emotionally engaged, too good, too upright and self-contained, you know, something's gone wrong, quote unquote. And obviously there's the thing is that there's no not going wrong. Everybody goes wrong in a different way.
In their own way. No,
wrong is who we become. And you know,
exactly.
I think I was breastfed for many years. I would refuse to stop, but I also had a similar thing to you that was caused by something different, that wasn't to do with not breastfeeding. But the same kind of thing happened. And then I think that's partly, maybe this is why we are interested in this kind of stuff, is because we can't help but see it, because we have differentiated in a different way. And so we are aware, you know, there's this Winnicott idea of the fear of breakdown. And I really like this quote, think of starting a book with it, LOL, which is like, the apocalypse isn't coming, it's already happened. You know, and for a lot of people, their breakdown that they replicate, or that they fear replication of, is something they experienced very early on, because they basically became differentiated too early, and it's fucking terrifying. So you absolutely have to go through.
I think I did this. I actually did relive the split in a secondary way. You know, absolutely. my spectacular midlife crisis, like every aspect of it in a way was relived, but consciously as an adult. You know, and I think, you know, at the risk of being indulgent, but I think the part of the reason why I ended up having such serious and ongoing issues with alcohol is in a way a sort of attempt to I don't know, to make something in the world represent the thing that I didn't have, or something, you know, like to imbue it with properties that it doesn't have, you know, but that were lacking, you know, in some ways. So it's like, you know, like red breast milk or something.
No, absolutely. Like, it is a bit of oblivion. And I think I started to drink milk at like, where was it, like 28? And I think actually, I mean, this wasn't to replicate a breakdown, because I think, you know, it just to send me to sleep. And I think actually, anyway, but
well, exactly, because the things that I associate, you know, I came to understand that I associate with alcohol are feeling warm and being able to go to sleep. You know, I mean, it couldn't really be much more obvious in some ways, right? There's always more complexity to it, right? And it's also to do with the first time you get drunk and what that, you know, that experience made you feel, and those sorts of things, right? But, you know, just in some very, very vulgar way, you know, that it's obvious that it took on some of the properties that we would usually associate with, you know, being breastfed and being soothed, I suppose, in some ways as well.
And I think that word vulgar is like very interesting, because of course, like any symptom can mean anything, you know. We're all highly, you know, have our own personal experiences, and everything's granularized, and everything can be broken down and we do therapy for years. But often I think that like the dynamic to a really well-trained psychoanalyst can be very obvious immediately, because in a way, in the vulgar sense, we do follow, there is a universal of similarity of dynamics, which is we all separate from our parents, and we die. Things go wrong in different ways, and we die. Things go wrong in different ways.
And we have to pay taxes.
So people who to harp on about capital mobility, people who have corporations or have loads of money don't anymore, but everybody else does. They're not
no, you're
humans.
quite,
They're
you're
not
quite
humans.
right.
Not
You're right.
humans.
So that whole phrase, you know, the two certainties, death and taxes, isn't actually true.
And I think that's
why.
actually the problem of our world today.
God, you're right, because it's the same people who don't pay tax who want to live forever.
Yes, exactly. No, honestly,
they're the immortality junkies.
Yes, and not to be too like, again, I don't think it's like any individual's fault. This is a systemic political thing. But like, I honestly, we and in a way, you know, not to be like everything we talk about is pointless, but like, unless we sort out this capital mobility issue or like find a way around it, with like, what's the point of anything, you know?
But what do you mean by capital mobility issue? In that, I know we discussed it before.
So basically, just like no, if you can move money around to different countries, well, basically, society relies on capitalism only functions insofar as it redistributes. You know, that the state is there to mitigate. When state is tied to capital, there's no mitigation because they're acting on behalf of those people who want to avoid the mitigation. And we're living the non-mitigated result of capitalism, and it's a shit show. And it's generating all of these, you know, things on the level of the imaginary that we can really enjoy talking about. But you know, but yeah, no, I think this. So I think we in a way it's understandable that we feel anxiety in this world that is really unstable because of unpaid taxes and the eroded family and the eroded family and stuff is in order to make more money out of us. Individual person feels more precarious, is more likely to obey ideological, you know, commands of capitalism, has to pay more. You know, you save a lot of money when you're married and you have a family. You know, if you parcel everybody off, that's the latest, you know, colonialized frontier to cross and to profit from. So we can see that, you know, maybe my milk drinking, which I guess started in like 2016, was a symptom of the fact that I and everybody else feels very precarious because of the world that we've created for ourselves. Well, we haven't, but has ended up.
Yeah, you've inherited.
We've inherited. But and I think, you know, that the obviously climate change is happening and stuff, but this sort of like apocalyptic fantasy expresses the fact that we know things have gone really, really fucking wrong. And this sort of childlike nightmare scenarios, which are, you know, two things can be true at the same time. You can be a hypochondriac and still have a disease. This is the predicament of being human.
Yeah.
And often I think the thing with psychoanalysis is people go thinking that it's going to fix everything, but they realize that everything that they're afraid of actually exists, but they were being a hypochondriac about it. And when you can overcome the hypochondria, you can actually face the problem, which is the same as the Marxist idea of take off the chain, you know, the flowers from the chain so you can pick the living flower, but the chains are still there and you've got to pick the living flower and it's fucking difficult. But yeah, like I think that we are seeking out teat sucking, and the teat sucking is convenient to keep us from picking the living flower.
Yeah. Pick your milk wisely, kids.
Yes, make sure it's, I'm not going to go on about vegans. Make sure it's actual milk, not MYLK. But yeah.
No plant-based milk here. Kids.
I was so sorry. This is okay. I'm not going to make a really phallic joke right now about vegan.
No, but I mean, I think wasn't that, you know, the last Mad Max film was kind of about milk, wasn't it?
Was it? I haven't seen it. The 2015 one. Or...
Yeah. There was an interesting milk thing that probably, you know, someone who's a better cultural critic could explain. But yeah, I mean, it's you know, when you get down to it, like these fundamental substances or things that stand in for substances, let's say, you know, I mean, it's kind of fascinating. I mean, I guess we already discussed oil. What about will be blood, you know, and these kind of absolutely constitutive fundamental forms of, you know, the things that civilization are based on. You know, are they based on milk? Are they based on cum? Are they based on oil?
Oil to me, when you talk about that, it's like
what is a cum-based civilization, Helen?
Well, do you know what I think though? That it's very, this primal stuff, it's very childlike, you know, it's the 3-year-old's logic. But I do think that the oil thing, and obviously there's a disgust with oil, rightly, you know, because of what it's done to the planet. But it is sort of like, I really, really hate, I really, really hate being the prude that I am. Well, I'm not actually, but you know, is the like talking about periods all the time. But it is a little bit like the witch that is Mother Nature's aborted period. Like it's her aborted baby is like the oil, this like dead people that were, you know, these dead animals that are kind of like seeping.
Yeah.
They're like dead cells. It's kind of gross. Sorry, everybody.
No. It's very interesting. I mean, I have a friend who's vegan, but drinks her own menstrual blood and has done since she was a teenager. You seem shocked. But from a scientific point of view, it's actually very interesting because, of course, I mean, menstrual blood is the shedding of the uterine wall with all of the nutrients that are sort of hypothetically for a child. So if you like, the blood is very rich in, you know, minerals and vitamins and whatnot, right? So and it's produced by your body. So if you're a vegan, you're in a sense rather efficiently recycling in a positive way the nutrients that your own body, if you like, needs, you know, for your hypothetical I think it's kind of amazing.
I wouldn't go there personally, but it does sound like this is like a classic kind of like, this would be like the perfect like woke like what do you call it, you know, sort of like neo product, you know, like if you could find a way to like tap into the sort of like that like period obsessed market, you could probably make quite a lot of money.
No, but the weird thing about this example is that you couldn't,
from yourself,
because this is free.
Yes, exactly.
You know, there is in fact nothing to capitalize upon, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you could sell a little, but you can get like a moon cup or something and collect it. Anyway, that's it. That's all you need.
Yeah,
you're really appalled by this, aren't you? This idea. I mean, it's interesting. This person that I'm talking about is actually a scientist and is not in the least bit woke. I mean, they're vegan for utilitarian reasons. Yeah. You know, and we could, you know, I argue with her about this, but it's, you know, that it's interesting, if you see what I mean, because I don't, you know, but I know what you're talking about, which is something slightly different, I suppose, which is that that it's like the, you know, Instagram poetization of menstruation.
Yes, exactly. I think that's maybe, and you're right, like when it is just a self-fulfilling thing, then, you know, you can't. Obviously it's interesting because like there's the breast milk thing that a lot of people, you know, some women create lots of breast milk and then they share it with people who can't produce breast milk to give to their children and stuff. And that's something that I knew that colostrum, which is that thing, was being sold to bodybuilders, maybe still is, as a product, but you know, that hasn't really been marketized. But yeah, there is this
because you only produce it once, I think, or it's right at the beginning, because, and the thing, I think they only really realized this I mean, obviously people knew about it intuitively, but the fact that they didn't, you know, people understood what it was, because basically, so colostrum is the milk that's produced after the birth, so it's the first milk after the birth, and what it allegedly or apparently contains is all of the, almost like a vaccine, like let's not corrupt it by saying that, but all of the, because it immediately creates the antibodies, because basically the moment you've had your child, then your body creates like the antibodies, and then you feed them to your child so that it's protected. So it's immensely powerful thing. You know, it's a very, very important thing. So I know that today, that even if a woman has had a very difficult birth and she's not able to breastfeed, they will take the breast milk from her using a pump and save the colostrum for the baby, rather than, you know, so even if she's not well enough to breastfeed immediately, if you see what I mean, if the birth was very difficult. I
was going to say, but interestingly, Rupi Kaur, I think, became famous first of all for this very aesthetic picture of herself on Instagram having a period.
Oh right, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but there is something, this sort of like righteousness of the sort of female produced muck is very strange. you know, but again, anything that is particularized and attached to a particular essence can endow a group or a person with a moral kind of transcendent charge. But it's just, you know, it is what it is, you know.
No, but exactly. But then if it is what it is, then it's a substance, like, you know, and of course it's not immune from all of these ideological pressures, but it's also, you know, something as well. I mean, this is so the kind of either I don't know, the excessive celebration of it or the excessive disgust or whatever do tell you something, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
Like, you know, that it's a thing that has these properties. We can kind of speak about it in a neutral way, you know, and say, well, this is what, you know, science thinks this thing is for, right? And we can say, oh yes, it looks like it has this function, and you know, and we seem to be accurate enough about it. I mean, that's not to say that research into women's health is in any way sufficient, because it clearly isn't, right? There's loads of ways in which, like, the male body is taken as the paradigm, and things that only affect women, like endometriosis and things like that, are not taken very seriously, and lots of women are fobbed off when they have particular pain, and you know, there's loads of articles.
Adam's rib, nothing has changed.
No, well, I mean, you know, exactly. I mean, you can have you know, there's some very interesting feminist work on this, you know, that male and female bodies are not similar in loads of ways, and that to fantasize that there's a paradigmatic neutral body, or that the neutral body is male, it, you know, creates all these problems, because, you know, there are differences, and you know, even though that's sort of like weirdly taboo thing to say.
This is the thing that's very strange, is that, like, again talking about the force-fed milk, the child's logic, force-fed milk, and the reality of our complex divided subjectivity, I think this is an example of it, where we are hijacked by exceptions when we all know what the rule is. And this is the thing that I think this is the trouble when you have a childlike logic, is that the adult thing is two things are true at the same time, and we can handle that. And that is the nature of reality. This is the material nature of reality. This isn't just some like wisdom statement that you have to get used to life being difficult. It's like, no, life is difficult, and that's what it is. And if it wasn't that, it wouldn't exist. And, you know, it's antagonistic and ruptured, and beyond that, you know, around this rupture, two truths are true at the same time, which is, you know, we are born into whatever, and there are people who don't fit into this, and this is totally fine and should be accepted. Also, that we are born twice. We are born into the world as an animal, and then born into language as a human, although we are always born into language immediately, because language is a sort of thing that exists in the world. We swim in, you know, we're talked to as children, but we enter into, let's say, self-divided contradictory subjectivity. And so therefore, of course, you can be born into a sex and experience a different gender. Like, that's total, like, but it's the thing that's very ideological is when everything gets turned into absolute single truths. And it is all contradictory, because basically everything is contradictory. We live in a contradictory world, but when we ignore contradictory at the level of, like, say, an idea, the contradiction is always there. So we have, for instance, this idea that, you know, we have sex and then gender, but then also all of these other things where it's like, well, that's not enough, and then we turn to a sexist absolutism, because it's just not at this time where everyone is anxious, precarious, and we are living with this inadequate, absolutist, totalitarian, which is never total because it doesn't contain contradiction, logic of the playground. I think it drives us mad. Yes.
All right. In conclusion to our A side, we have been driven mad. Everything is complicated. Life is miserable. You know, but we must carry on talking, which we will do on the B side. So thank you very much to everyone for listening, and we really appreciate it. We will see you. We won't see you. You will be silently participating in yet further ramblings from us in the B side.
Our collective teats will be, I don't know, like overflowing
with toxic
nonsense.
milk.
Yeah,
okay. All right. Bye bye.